everyone. Thank you so much for coming over. Thank you, Tracy, Modern Web, South Bay JS, and Angular Mountain View Group for giving me this opportunity to share some knowledge about creating and publishing Angular component libraries. By the way, that was the hardest part of the talk, taking these 4 names. I had to remember those. So thank you so much. So when we think about building component libraries, we generally tend to think about building open source libraries. But the stuff that I'm going to share today does not only work with open source libraries, but also it works with, if you're working on an isolated library within your own organization, or if you're working on something which is inner source within your own organization. So if you want to take away only one thing from this talk, it will be the motivation to go and write amazing component libraries. So with that, here is the boring hello slide. My name is Accessor Firdousi. I have about a decade of JavaScript experience, which is zillion years in JavaScript world. I do some open source stuff. Very fortunate enough to work with Fortune 5 companies for the last couple of years. I also manage the Angular Pakistan group, which is about 6,000 Angular developers at this time. We started last year. Other than that, I also do the curation stuff on ngdoc.io, which is the unofficial Angular guide, if you guys know about it. And I also try to learn and do some community stuff, which is speaking and learning at conferences and meetups like this. So with that, let's start with something called Library Lifecycle, or LLC, in Angular. So the first step when you build a library is you plan it. So you should do some research and planning on what exactly your library should offer. What parts of the library will be available to the consumer, which actually means which components, directives, and services are you going to expose. So the bottom line is you decide the public interface of your library. Next up is pretty obvious, the development phase. You go ahead and build the library. And parallel to this component library dev phase, it's a good idea to also build a test suite. So in the test suite, the first thing is your unit test. It's always a good idea to write unit tests for your components, services, directives, and whatnot. Next is a integration test suite. I don't want to call it an integration test suite, but whatever. So it's an integration setup. So by this, I mean a demo app inside of your component library project. This demo app does not need to be a very sophisticated, having a very sophisticated build system. It can just directly reference your component library. And the idea behind having this kind of integration setup is you actually can test your library as you build them on the fly. You can use browser sync or live reload or stuff like that. So if you have looked at the material code, they also have a very similar setup to this. And then there's environment test. So now environment test is something very important. Obviously, it's not safe to assume what kind of build system your consumer will be using. So you should actually have a real project, maybe an Angular CLI project, and then you literally npm install your library into this test environment so that you make sure that your library would work with any build system. This setup will actually give you some confidence that your library just works by npm installing it anywhere. And next is packaging and publishing, which we'll talk later in detail. So in Angular 1, there were a couple of dozens of ways of building component libraries, which was obviously a mess. The good thing in Angular 2 is we have established a contract which dictates how every Angular library package should actually look like. This is actually amazing, and why it's amazing is because every well-written Angular 2 plus library will actually have a very similar structure. It will look exactly the same. Jason Aiden on the Angular team gave a very amazing talk in NGCon 2017, and I would definitely recommend you guys should go and look at it. So the enhancement phase is where obviously you go ahead and make your bug fixes and stuff like that. The last is the growth hacking, where obviously if you have a project that you think is useful to the community and you want to open source it, you go ahead and go to these kind of meetups and conferences and try to build a community around it, and then look for PRs on your GitHub repo. So that's it. You plan and develop a component library, build a solid testing environment around it, and then publish it. That's all about library lifecycle in Angular. So let's talk about some essentials of building a Angular component library. So what do we want? We want an Angular library to be reusable module that is packaged and released. much like other modules like Angular Core, Angular HTTP, or Angular Material. So the eventual goal is that the consumer should be able to npm install your library, and it should just work. So the first thing is you create a package.json file by npm initting it. We will just discuss only the very few important fields that are part of the package.json files. So the first is the main field, which defines primary entry point to your package. Main is the standard mechanism for pointing to the module code inside of your library. So any system which relies on CommonJS modules would actually look for this specific field to get to the entry of your module. And if someone, the consumer of your library, tries to do a require on your package, he will actually get the object exported by this file. Next is the module field, which is used by tools consuming ECMAScript modules with ES5 code, for example, the CLI, the Webpack, and Rollup. Next is ES 2015 field, something relatively new. It is used by tools consuming ECMAScript modules plus ES 2015, like Clojure, custom Webpack builds. So one last is the peer dependencies. So all of you, I believe, already know about dependencies and dev dependencies. But what are peer dependencies? Peer dependencies tells npm that we need these packages to be installed in the host project, because we in the library will not be installing them. So have you ever come across unmet peer dependencies error in npm? Anyone? Awesome. So the unmet peer dependencies error comes because the project in which you're installing that library does not have the exact same setup that the library requires. And that's what you actually define in peer dependency, that my library needs this version of Angular, this version of RxJS. Next is a module file. So you will write a module which contains statements like imports and exports and all your library symbols. This will also have an entry file, which is the index.ts file if you're doing TypeScript, which exports that base module. And in the consumer, you will just be doing an import on the same thing with your package name. Next, I want to discuss how would you make your Angular components Intellisense Enable. So for that, you need a DTS file or d.ts file, whichever way you want to say. For that to happen, you go to your tsconfig file and turn on the declaration field, which will actually give you something like this, which is the DTS file, which is basically all the signatures of your methods and of your lifecycle hooks within your component. This actually helps IDEs generate IntelliSense as you type the code. Next is how would you make your components platform independent. So let's look at this example, very naive basic example of adding a class to a component. This class, this method uses something called class list, and then it calls a method called add, which is basically the generic DOM method. You should try to avoid it because this actually assumes that your code will be running in the browser, which may not be the case. Maybe your Angular code is running on the server. So what you should ideally do is rely on the renderer. They have render 2, render 3, whatever, but you should rely on the renderer, which under the hood takes care of the environment and then does the same thing for you. This section is important because I have seen several talks on building component libraries, but I have hardly seen someone speaking in detail about this. So what if you want to make your components form enabled? What if you want to surround your custom components inside of a form? Maybe a template-driven form or reactive form like this. And probably someone wants to put an ng model directive on top of your custom component. So what if I do this? In fact, yeah. So to make this happen, you have to implement the control value accessor interfaces, and you have to learn how to do abstract accessors and change detection, which I will show you in a bit. So what happens if you just take this raw custom input component, put it in a form? You will see a beautiful error, something like this, which actually says, I don't know how to talk to this component. So what's happening is the custom component is not able to communicate with the form API. Well, so what you would do is look for something called control value accessor, which is basically an interface. What this does is it has these few very important methods that you would implement on your custom component. The first is the write value function, which actually writes values from the model into the view or any other DOM property if you like. It's where you would want to update the model or state used in your views. Register on change and register on touch are kind of the same. They're used to register a handler that should be fired when something in the view has changed. So basically, it's the other way around, view updating the model. The last is the set disable set, which is very easy to understand. It actually marks a custom component as disabled. This method can get very handy if you want to ignore a particular component inside of your form. So let's look at how we can implement custom value accessors. So the first thing we do is implement the write value function, which just checks if a value has actually changed or not. If it doesn't, it doesn't do anything. If it has changed, then it'll just go ahead and update the value. This underscore value, you can think of it as the state of the custom component. Next, we can look at the register on change method of control value accessor. What Angular does, it passes a reference of a function. It's a magic function which actually does the updation and which keeps the model and view in sync. So it passes a reference of that method. What you do in this method is actually just cache the reference and call this. So I name this reference propagate change, but you don't have to name it propagate change. You can name it whatever. And then whenever you want the model and view to sync, you just call that method. For example, in this on change, I'm calling the same propagate change and passing it the values. I call this on change. If you look at this line where I have where I have a simple input in there, on the input event, I'm calling this on change method and passing the event to it. The last thing that you would want to do after implementing control value accessors is you would need to extend the ng value accessors. So in order to get hold of a control value accessor for a form control, Angular internally injects all values that are registered on the ng value accessor token. I'm not going to discuss tokens and multi-tokens and stuff like that, but I have a lot of resources in the end. You can if you don't have any idea about what are tokens and ng value accessor token, then you can look into those. So all we need to do is to extend the multi-provider for ng value accessor with your own value accessor instance, which is in this case your component. So in Angular, it is possible to extend existing providers to avoid duplicate providers for clashing. And for this communication to work, we need to tell ng value accessor token that our class exists and has got something to do with the data binding. So what you would do is you just create this custom value provider, and what actually we are doing is you're saying if somebody asks for an ng value accessor, you will just provide me a custom input component instance instead of the default ng value accessor that comes in. So now finally we are able to make our custom component be used inside of a form. Then you can pull out values with the form API, or if you have an ng model, you can just directly pull out the values from it. So that's about it. These are a few blogs. I did a very detailed few blogs on the same topic. Pascal has some great resources on this as well, so you can go ahead and check that out. Next is how would you make your components AOT enabled? So for this, in fact, in first place, why in this world would you even care about AOT? So you care about AOT because you want faster rendering, you want fewer async calls, obviously you want smaller Angular framework size because you don't want to send the compiler down to the browser. And on top of that, you want to detect template errors ahead of time. And there are several other benefits of doing AOT. So to make your components AOT enabled, you would go ahead and install compiler CLI and the platform server. So when you install compiler CLI, it gives you a new compiler on top of the TypeScript compiler called the ngc compiler. It's basically a drop-in replacement for TSC, adding some additional options to it. It gives additional output to support AOT, and we'll look into that in just a sec. So you can use ngc as a command line tool, or you can use it inside of your build system programmatically. Now, ngc is configured much the same way as tsconfig, so folks usually create a copy of their tsconfig file and alias it with .aot, but that's not required, it's not a requirement, but maybe you can separate out a tsconfig file just for your AOT requirements. So before getting into the specifics of how you configure tsconfig file for AOT, here are the 3 top level things you should consider. So don't use JIT, the just-in-time compiler, unless you really need it. And I won't be discussing why and when you would need JIT. There is a very good resource that I'm pointing to. You should definitely check that out if you really need to use JIT. Second is your ng module should be statically analyzable, and the third is you would have to provide metadata.json files with your d.ts file, and you'll get to see how we generate that. So let's start with how would you make your modules statically analyzable. I have a few examples for you, but this does not exhaust the number of things that can come while you're trying to do this. So first off is you want to convert all your, so these examples are coming from some practical examples that I came across. So you cannot use your Lambda functions. You have to convert them into simple functions and just return your component from that. So maybe the ngc, if you try to do that, the ngc will actually error out saying consider replacing the function or Lambda with a reference. Another would be converting your default exports. So that also doesn't work if you want to make your components AOT enabled. So if there is a default export, you just convert it into a simpler export. Next would be marking members public. So the members in your component which you are trying to use inside of your template, they should always be public, otherwise ngc will not allow you to do that. Another example can be converting dynamic component templates. So if you're fond of ES6, you must have tried the templating syntax. ngc has problems with this as well, so you will go ahead and change it to something simpler. You can use a simple object literal to do the same thing which you do it with the dynamic templates. Another example could be exporting components explicitly. So you may have done this in the past when you say export asterisk from something, which means export everything from their file. This also doesn't work, so you will have to do explicit exports. Static selectors, I don't know for what reason you will do this. I got this example from somewhere, so I'm just pasting it here. But in case your selectors are dynamic, that also won't work, so you'll have to do something like this, shown in this example. You just have to export all the selector names and then choose one of the selectors. No dynamicism in that. So the bottom line, so all these examples tell the same thing. Be more explicit about what you're trying to do, what you're trying to export, what you're trying to import, and help the AOT compiler analyze your code. Next and last on the AOT enabling is getting the metadata.json file. So as I said, ngc is basically a superset of tsc, which generates all these extra files. What we need is the top 3 files, and we actually don't need the ng factory and ng style files, and you also don't push them to your repos. And the reason why you don't have to push ng factory and ng style files in your package is they're very compiler version specific. So if someone is using a different version of the compiler, it might also fail. So you just have to look into the meta.json files and the d.ts files. So for that, by the way, TSC works on the compiler options in your tsconfig file. But for ngc to work, you need to have something called Angular compiler options, in which the minimum requirements are these 2. So skip template code gen tells ngc to stop when the metadata file is actually, it will cause an error in the application that is using your package. The strict metadata emit tells ngc not to generate the ng factory and ng style files that we just talked about. So if you have that, you can simply do a ngc-p, which is a path to your tsconfig file, which will give you these 2 files. that makes your components AOT enabled. On packaging, there are several things to talk about in packaging, but I think Jason Aiden's talk is very comprehensive. You should go look into it. We'll talk about a few optimizations, things that are good to have when you're packaging your component. So first off is you should actually consider inlining your templates and styles. And why would you do it is obviously to avoid unnecessary async calls to get to the templates and styles. You don't have to do that in your dev setup. Your build system should be the one doing this thing, inlining your templates and styles. Publish fewer ES modules and produce FESM. FESM is a flattened ECMAScript modules, in which what you do is you concatenate your JS files cleverly into a single file so that you don't have to actually go ahead and look at 5 different files. The build system does not have to do that. Why I mark them in red is there are certain caveats when you try to do FESM. So for that to happen, first of all, you have to set a flat Moduleout file and then give the name of a file. This file is kind of the same as your index.js file, but it has the flattened version of your whole application. And then you also need to provide the module identifier for your FESM. Kitchen syncing is something that people generally talk about. This is something which I think the Material project also did initially, and I've seen several other projects do this in my workplace. Is what they do is they have single module and they import all those modules and then export it from that one base module. This actually doesn't help tree shaking. What happens is the tree shaker or any build system, after doing this kitchen syncing, assumes that you're using all of your modules, and in fact you may not be using all those modules. So what you do is you use one ng module per component, and you write a separate component, module for your components. So this way, if you import just the module A, you will just get module A and not all the components. Produce a single FESM if. So this is a long discussion. Obviously, we don't have a lot of time. Producing a single FESM, I believe personally, is not a very good idea. And why it's not a good idea is for the reason we just talked about. I would prefer concatenating all the dependent modules into a single FESM. For example, if you are building a tab module, then probably there is a tab container module which has another child module called the tab modules. You probably will bundle these two out into a single FESM because they are dependent on each other. Also, I have done things like grouping out similar components into a FESM. That also works because if someone is actually importing one component and the other component is very likely to be used, you can also do a single FESM for those things as well. But please don't do a single FESM for the whole library. That doesn't really work unless you are actually building a component library which just has maybe one component, one directive. In that case, it does work. But if you're building a UI library like Material, please never do that. Okay, on versioning, all of you, I'm sure, know about semantic versioning. So I would highly suggest you stick to semantic versioning, and you should know npm commands like the npm version, which helps you bump your major, minor, or patch versions. Let's go. Okay, so we already talked about making our components form enabled, making our components AOT enabled. The last is how would you make our components theme enabled. For this, I recently did a detailed blog about it, so honestly I won't be discussing it here, but it's a good idea to go ahead and read it, especially if you're building a UI component library which has a lot to do with styles and stuff. You can also look at Angular Material and how they handle themes. That's also a good idea to learn about making your components theme enabled. Okay. So these are the few things. I won't go into them. I won't go into the details of each of them. But these are a few things that I would suggest that you should get a good hold off before you actually build your component library. These are the things which would come across a lot. For example, how would you access your DOM? How would you query your DOM? How do you do content projection? You should know a lot about how does Lifecycles work, like the ng after content init and ng after view init, and all these things. Ng destroy is also very important. lifecycle that you should know about. Angular 2 now has some good event management. You can use the event manager, or you can use the renderer to listen to global events. So things like these are very important. One important thing I think that I missed on the second number is the ng modules and the scope of components and services. So there is a very good blog on that. The idea is you should know in detail about the scopes of component inside of a module and the scopes of services when they're injected inside of a module. These are very different. This is literally the last thing we will discuss. So I copied this over from Philip Silva's very nice Angular starter lib, in which he has built. He has a small build system. You don't have to necessarily do all of this. You can do these things manually, or probably use Webpack or something else to do that. But let's just go step by step and see what he's doing. So the first thing is probably inlining your resources, which we talked about, inlining your templates and styles. The second thing is compiling your code to ES 2015. So here you can see he's using ngC programmatically, not on the terminal, in which he's specifying his tsconfig file to go ahead and look for those Angular compiler options. The next thing in the pipeline is you compile your code to ES5, because obviously you want to provide both versions, both flavors of your library, ES 2015 and ES5. So you again use the ngC. Next is you produce, so since you're using ngC, you have already generated the DTS files as well as the metadata JSON files. So just copy it over to this folder. And then lastly, he's using rollup, which is very much recommended to be used. So he's using a rollup to bundle up all his stuff like ES5 and ES 2015 entry files. And after that, probably there's one thing left, which is copying over your package.json files and README files. So you would get a very nice distribution folder, which you can just cd into and just do npm publish, and you will have your library in the npm repo. Lastly, the catch, obviously, if something breaks in any of these steps. This is a component library, very small one, which came out of Angular Pakistan. It's called the Angular drag and drop library. Very famous. It has like 25,000 downloads in the last month. You should definitely go ahead and check that out. So shout out to Ubaidur Rahman. He's one of the members of Angular Pakistan community, and you should really definitely check this out. It has some good ideas which we discussed today. These are all the resources. I have grouped them in order, so please go ahead and check that out. Thank you so very much. Go ahead and build some amazing stuff.